They tried to drag a black woman out of her daughter's graduation, until the crowd realized who she really was. When the event staff at Branston Hill Academy tried to remove a quiet black woman from the front row of their elite graduation ceremony, no one in the room expected the storm that was coming. No one realized she was Commander Nia Calloway, a decorated military intelligence officer with 27 years of service, now a senior advisor to Homeland Security. And absolutely no one noticed the 20 plain-clothed federal agents scattered throughout the crowd who stood up, one by one, not with words, not with weapons, but with presence, silent, calculated, unwavering. It started with a whisper, a murmur of confusion rippling through the rows of wealthy families in designer suits and pearls, as two coordinators leaned down and told Nia, "Ma'am, we need you to move, and the section is reserved for invited VIPs. Nia didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply showed them her ticket, looked them calmly in the eye, and said, "This is my seat." But that wasn't enough. They pressed. They hovered. They tried again, this time hinting that this area needs to look appropriate. That's when it started, subtle at first, then unmistakable. A man in the back row rose slowly, crossed his arms. Another near the side door adjusted his cuff and stepped forward. A woman 3 rows up straightened her spine and shifted her stance. These weren't parents. These were professionals. Trained, ready, watching. The moment was still, but electric. Nobody shouted, nobody threatened. Yet the pressure in the room shifted like air before a storm. And by the time Nia's daughter was called to the stage, every single person in that gym knew exactly who Nia Calloway was and what true strength looks like. Not loud, not aggressive, but planted, present, unshakable. And when she finally stood, not because she was forced, but because her daughter's name echoed through the room like thunder, the applause wasn't just loud. It was different. It carried the weight of respect earned, not given. You're about to hear the story of what really happened that day, and why sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that never needs to rise. Nia Calloway had parked her weathered Ford Bronco near the edge of the school's upper lot, just below the hillside where rich families lined up luxury SUVs like trophies. She didn't care. That truck had history. She'd driven it through 6 states, slept in it during a week-long reconnaissance training in Arizona, and taught her daughter how to steer it when Jasmine was barely tall enough to see over the wheel. It rattled in the mornings and the AC blew warm on one side, but it was hers. And this morning, it carried something more important than prestige: pride. Nia sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting her eyes scan the sea of pastel dresses and navy blue blazers milling across the courtyard. She watched parents checking their watches, adjusting their ties, handing their kids last-minute tissues and mints. It was the kind of scene she rarely belonged to: private academies, manicured lawns, whispered conversations about internships and legacy admissions. But today, she was here, and not just as a mother. She stepped out, brushed a hand across her jacket. Civilian today, no uniform, just black slacks, a dark green blazer, and a silver pin at her collar that meant more than anyone around her could guess. It wasn't military issue. It was personal, a gift from her late husband before he deployed for the last time. Jasmine had insisted she wear it. "Mom, you're part of this. Don't hide," she'd said that morning. And Nia had nodded, more moved than she'd let on. The gymnasium buzzed with activity as she entered. An usher handed her a printed program and waved vaguely toward the front rows. "Families with honor cords get priority," he mumbled, distracted. Nia thanked him and made her way down the aisle. The air was thick with perfume, floor polish, and nerves. Her heels clicked against the hardwood until she reached row A, center left. Her name was printed in small font on a folded placard: Jasmine had arranged that herself. Nia smiled, just barely, and sat down. Around her, a few heads turned. Some offered polite nods. Others didn't. She was used to that. Not everyone expects someone who looks like her to be seated up front, alone, confident, composed. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, eyes forward, posture tall. She didn't need the room's approval. She only came for one thing: to see her daughter walk across that stage, head high, and claim every inch of the future she'd worked for. The Branston Hill Gymnasium was built to impress. High-vaulted ceilings, banners for every championship imaginable, and soft gold lighting that made the stage glow like a Broadway production. But even in all its polish, Nia could feel the weight in the air, that subtle tightness that crept in whenever she walked into a space that wasn't expecting her. Families in pastel and pearls filled the seats around her, their conversations clipped and filtered. Some talked about summer programs at Stanford. Others debated which Ivy League school had the stronger pre-med track. No one spoke directly to her. A few glanced sideways, offering tight smiles that disappeared before they reached their eyes. Nia didn't mind. She'd long learned how to read a room without giving it power over her. But it didn't escape her that while she sat silently in the front row, watching the stage with pride and anticipation, she was being watched for entirely different reasons. 2 rows behind her, a woman in a cream blazer leaned in toward her husband and whispered something. He looked directly at Nia, blinked twice, then looked away. A group of teenagers on the far side of the aisle glanced over, then laughed. Not cruelly, but knowingly, like they understood a joke no one else had been told. Nia remained still. She adjusted the crease in her slacks, the printed program in half, and kept her gaze forward. She wasn't new to this. She had stood on borders under hostile fire and debriefed senators who mistook her silence for inexperience. The eyes in this room didn't rattle her, but she did wonder, briefly, if Jasmine could feel it from where the students were lined up backstage. If she could sense the tension, not explosive, but sharp, like the quiet before a glass cracks. A few rows away, a father stood up and waved toward the entrance, calling out to his son with that joyful pride only parents know. A photographer snapped pictures near the podium. On stage, a student council rep nervously tested the microphone. And then, just as Nia thought things were settling into rhythm, 2 staffers in black polos began walking down the side aisle with the kind of purpose that made her straighten without thinking. They weren't smiling. They weren't holding programs, and they were headed directly for her. Something in their gait said this wasn't about welcoming guests. It was about removing one. The 2 staffers moved with that brand of overconfidence that comes from having authority in only very specific places. Both wore matching black polo shirts, with the Branston Hill crest embroidered in silver on the chest. One was tall and wiry, with a walk that said he didn't want to be doing this. The other was stockier, early 30s maybe, with a clipboard under one arm and a radio clipped to his hip like it made him important. Nia noticed them approaching, but didn't react. She kept her posture steady, her eyes forward. She had seen this kind of energy before. On military bases, in corporate elevators, even at PTA meetings where people thought their position gave them permission to question her presence. The taller one leaned in first, voice low but curt. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I need to check your seat assignment." Nia turned to him calmly, unfazed. "Is there a problem?" The shorter one stepped closer, already reaching for the placard in front of her seat. "This row is for reserved guests, confirmed names only. We've had some seating confusion." Nia reached into her purse, pulled out the invitation Jasmine had printed herself, complete with seating designation and personalized code. "It's confirmed," she said, handing it to him without blinking. The man scanned it, but his face didn't shift. "Still, this doesn't match our latest updated list. We're going to have to ask you to move to the overflow section in the back." Naya tilted her head slightly, not aggressive, but precise. "This seat has my name on it. Your volunteer usher walked me here." The taller man glanced around, clearly uncomfortable now, but the shorter one, clipboard guy, held his ground. "We've been asked to keep the front rows consistent, for press shots and continuity." Naya's eyes didn't flicker. "You mean optics?" He paused, momentarily caught. "No, I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," she replied. The people sitting nearby had begun to notice. Conversations dimmed. A few heads turned. A woman 3 seats down adjusted her sunglasses, but didn't look away. Naya remained seated, still calm, her voice low and deliberate. "Let me be clear. I am not moving. My daughter earned this moment, and I'm going to watch her walk that stage from this seat." The clipboard man stiffened, glancing at his colleague like he wasn't sure what to do next. The taller one shifted awkwardly, clearly aware that they were now being observed. Still, the shorter man wasn't ready to back down. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask one more time." "Don't," Naya cut in, sharp but quiet. "Don't make this a situation. Let me sit in peace." There was no anger in her voice, but something stronger. Authority, presence, unshaken power. And that was when a man in the 5th row stood up. Slowly, silently. He didn't say a word, didn't make a scene. He just crossed his arms and stared directly at the 2 staffers. Then, a second person stood, far side of the gym, near the bleachers. Then a third. None of them spoke. But their presence spoke volumes. They weren't guests. They weren't staff. And they definitely weren't moving. The room hadn't erupted, but something had shifted. The air felt tighter, like it was holding its breath. And the 2 men standing over Nia Calloway suddenly realized they weren't dealing with just a parent anymore. They were standing in the presence of something they didn't fully understand. Yet, the men who stood didn't wear anything that drew attention. No uniforms, no badges, no ceremonial pins. But something about them was unmistakable. It was in the way they held their bodies. Balanced, alert, not tense but ready. The kind of stance that doesn't need noise to command a room. The kind that says, without speaking, "We've done this before." Naya recognized it instantly. Her eyes didn't leave the staffers, but her senses widened, registering every subtle shift around her. These weren't strangers. These were people who moved like she moved, who had lived in the same rhythm of controlled response and silent readiness. She didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She knew some of their names before she ever saw their faces. They were colleagues from the field, some former, some still active. Not always in the same branch, not always in the same uniform. But bound by the same thread. Service, sacrifice, and the unspoken code that when one of your own is threatened, you don't sit still. Across the gym, a man with salt and pepper hair and a deliberate walk stepped into the aisle. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, his eyes locked on the clipboard staffer with a calm, so focused it felt like pressure. "Is there a reason this guest is being harassed?" he asked. The man blinked, caught off guard, as if realizing for the first time this was no longer a quiet corner incident. "Sir," he stammered, "this doesn't concern—" "It concerns me now," the man said, his voice still even, but sharper. "And I suggest you start rethinking your tone." The second staffer stepped back slightly, his face shifting from firm to uncertain. Around the room, more heads turned. Phones tilted. One student in the bleachers whispered to another. The air had changed. It was no longer about a seat. It was about recognition, of presence, of respect, of dignity that refused to bend. The man in the suit took one step closer, and even though his hands stayed by his sides, the energy in his body said one thing very clearly. "Don't test me." Nia finally glanced toward him, not with surprise, but acknowledgement. His name was Julian Wade. He had once pulled her out of a wrecked vehicle in an ambush near Mosul. She'd repaid that favor in Kandahar. Neither had ever spoken of it again. They didn't need to. That's the thing about real loyalty. It doesn't ask for attention. It just shows up. And now, as more of them began to rise in quiet support, it was clear this moment would not unfold the way those staffers had imagined. Not today. The moment Julian Wade stepped forward, time bent, just slightly, for Nia Calloway. The gym, the whispers, the awkward standoff, they all receded for a breath as her mind pulled her backward to a place no one else in that polished private academy could imagine. It was the outskirts of Kandahar, a stifling late afternoon 15 years ago, where heat shimmered off broken asphalt, and every shadow could hold something lethal. Her convoy had just cleared a village checkpoint when the world erupted. The IED wasn't crude, it was deliberate, expertly timed, and devastating. The lead vehicle lifted into the air like a toy tossed by an angry hand. The fireball that followed was instant. No warning, no time to think. Training had kicked in before fear could register. Nia had rolled from the passenger side, shoulder first, landing hard but functional. Smoke and sand choked the sky. Her team's comms went silent. She sprinted toward the wreckage, ignoring the heat singeing her sleeves and the blood sliding down her temple. She found Julian first, half buried under the collapsed roof panel, legs pinned, conscious but dazed. "You're not dying here," she'd muttered, more to herself than to him. She'd ripped off her tactical vest, jammed it under the edge, and braced her entire body weight against the frame. Metal groaned. Her muscles burned. And then it shifted, just enough for Julian to crawl free. But they weren't done. 3 more soldiers were still trapped. She'd dragged one out by the straps of his body armor while bullets cracked overhead. The second was unconscious, his leg shredded, and she'd carried him, fireman style, 30 yards to cover before returning for the third. That one was barely breathing, and she stayed with him, applying pressure and whispering nonsense into his ear until the evac arrived. Not because it helped, but because it kept him in the world a little longer. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did Julian. And from that moment forward, they never needed to exchange promises. A nod was enough. One look, and they'd move mountains for each other. And now, in this gym filled with polite applause and controlled lighting, Julian was here, standing again. Not in a combat zone, not under fire, but in defense of something just as sacred, her right to exist fully, unapologetically, and without question. Nia came back to the present as the tension around her thickened. 2 more men had stood up, one near the back, the other by the side door, both casual, calm, but unmistakably trained. One of them was Elena Ramos, an ex-special operations tech analyst turned DHS field lead. The other, Marcus Duval, had been under Nia's command during a covert intel mission that never made it into any report, but saved over 20 civilian lives in northern Syria. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was their statement. And it was clear now to everyone watching, including the staffers who had started this mess, that Nia Calloway wasn't just any woman in a nice blazer sitting in the wrong seat. She was someone people stood up for, and not because they were told to, because they remembered. By the time the 5th operative stood, the atmosphere inside Branston Hill's gym had shifted from uncomfortable tension to something far more charged, something electric, taut, and unmistakably alive. The rows of neatly lined folding chairs and polished stage banners suddenly felt insignificant against the quiet force building in the crowd. The 2 staffers, clipboard man and his reluctant partner, were no longer just enforcing a seating policy. They were standing at the center of a reckoning they didn't understand. Clipboard guy tried to maintain control, but his voice cracked as he muttered something into his radio, words lost under the sudden silence that had blanketed the front section. He looked down at Nia again, only now, His posture lacked the certainty it carried before. His hands, once resting with casual authority near his belt, now hovered awkwardly at his sides. Naya remained seated, eyes forward, hands resting in her lap, expression steady. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stood, but the room had already responded to her in a way louder than any outburst ever could. That's when the assistant principal entered, moving fast, but trying to look calm. She wore a headset and carried a walkie clipped to her belt, the kind of accessory that only makes someone seem in charge until a real leader is in the room. She approached the staffers with a forced smile and leaned in to whisper. "This needs to end," she said, her voice sharp but low. "Now!" Clipboard man gestured at the seat, whispering back. "She's not on the new list. I was told to clear row A." "And I'm telling you," the assistant principal cut in, her eyes flicking toward the standing crowd, "if you don't walk away, this becomes a public incident. Today. On camera." Her voice faltered slightly as she added, "I've already received 2 text messages from school board members asking what's happening. One of them mentioned federal involvement." That got his attention. He turned, finally looking beyond the woman in front of him, and truly saw the people who had risen. The posture, the eyes, the silence that screamed louder than any protest. These weren't angry parents. These weren't disruptive guests. These were trained professionals, men and women who didn't have to flex authority because they were authority. The clipboard dropped just slightly in his hand. His partner had already taken a step back. "Fine," he muttered. "Whatever." They turned and left without a word to Nia, slipping between the rows as if hoping to disappear into the crowd. The assistant principal gave Nia a tight, apologetic smile, but Nia didn't return it. She didn't need to. The moment had already passed her. Her focus returned to the stage, just as the lights shifted and the ceremony officially began. The principal stepped to the podium and offered a welcome filled with pre-scripted charm, while rows of students waited nervously behind the curtain. Jasmine was somewhere among them, bright-eyed, determined, a little anxious maybe, but unaware of the small war that had nearly overshadowed her day. Nia didn't look around. She didn't seek validation from the crowd, but she felt it, felt the weight of attention that had shifted from judgment to respect. Parents who had previously side-eyed her were now glancing over with something new in their expressions. Not pity, not confusion, but acknowledgement. Even a quiet reverence. She didn't bask in it. She simply accepted it. And when she finally allowed herself a slow, measured breath, it was the kind of exhale that didn't come from relief, but from power reclaimed without having to lift a finger. The agents who had stood up began sitting down again, one by one, without fanfare. Their message had been delivered, and the memory of what they'd done would linger in that space far longer than any speech or diploma. Nia didn't need to stand. She had already risen. The ceremony moved forward as if nothing had happened, but the room had changed. The applause for each student echoed louder than before, not out of obligation, but out of a collective need to recalibrate. People who had once stared at Nia like she didn't belong were now nodding subtly in her direction, whispering to their neighbors with expressions of quiet realization. The program continued. Names were called, students stepped forward, hands were shaken, flashbulbs popped, but it was clear that the rhythm had been reset. Jasmine Calloway stood in line behind 3 other students, holding her name card with both hands, fingers curled tight around the edges. Her cap was slightly askew from the breeze outside, but she hadn't adjusted it. Her thoughts weren't on her shoes or whether her gown hung straight. They were locked on one thing: her mother. From her place in the wings, she had caught the entire exchange. Not the words, but the energy, the movement, the way her mom had remained completely still, while others stood around her like a silent wall of protection. Jasmine had always known her mother was strong. She'd seen it in the way Naya handled bureaucrats, disrespectful neighbors, and cold shoulders at school meetings. But this was different. This was reverence. Jasmine's heart beat faster as the line moved. She thought about all the times growing up when her mom had told her, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful. Let the way you stand do the talking." At the time, Jasmine had rolled her eyes like any teenager. Now, standing here in a velvet-trimmed cap and gown, she understood every word. The principal's voice rang out, crisp and deliberate, calling names in alphabetical order. 2 more students walked, then 1, then a pause. The principal glanced at the card in her hand, then leaned slightly into the microphone. "Graduating with highest honors," she said, and her tone shifted, not scripted but sincere. "Jasmine Calloway." And in that fraction of a second, between her name and the first clap, the gym held its breath. Then it happened. Not just applause, a wave of it, loud, unified, deliberate. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the volume. It was the rhythm. The 6 agents who had once stood now clapped in perfect synchronization. A cadence not meant for noise, but for meaning. One of them brought his hand to his chest. Half salute, half acknowledgement. The rest followed. The crowd, unaware of what exactly they were witnessing, instinctively followed. Parents who didn't even know Jasmine were on their feet. A teacher wiped away a tear. The assistant principal stood frozen near the aisle, mouth parted slightly, eyes locked on the young woman walking toward the stage. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't beam. She walked like her mother, measured, grounded, present. Every step felt like it echoed off the walls. She accepted her diploma with steady hands and turned toward the audience, eyes scanning until she found the face she was looking for. Naya hadn't moved. She sat in the exact same posture, calm, upright, strong. But her eyes softened when they met her daughter's, and the slightest smile touched her lips. Jasmine's shoulders lifted just a bit higher, and she nodded once, subtly, before stepping off the stage. The applause lasted longer than anyone else's, not because she had done more, but because everyone in that room now understood she came from something, someone, unshakable. And for the rest of the ceremony, no one asked another parent to move. When the ceremony ended, and the caps flew into the air like birds finally released, the crowd spilled out into the afternoon sun in waves of laughter, cheers, and endless photo ops. Balloons bounced against the breeze, families clustered for pictures, and students shouted each other's names across the lawn. But Jasmine moved with quiet intention. She didn't run. She didn't search. She just walked, eyes scanning, knowing exactly who she was looking for. And then she saw her. Nia stood near the flagpole, exactly where Jasmine had told her to meet after the ceremony, hands clasped in front of her, blazer still buttoned, face still composed. But her eyes were different now, softer, warmer. Jasmine didn't say a word at first. She just walked straight into her mother's arms and hugged her, hard. Naya held her close, one hand on her back, the other gently on her shoulder, like she was grounding them both in a moment too big for words. For a second they didn't move. The chaos of the crowd faded into background noise. Jasmine pulled back just enough to speak. "I saw what they did." Naya looked at her calmly. "I know." Jasmine's jaw tightened. "I was going to stop everything. I was ready to come out and tell them exactly who you are." Naya's smile was faint, but filled with pride. "And that's why you didn't." Jasmine blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Because you knew I didn't need defending," Naya said. "You trusted I could handle it. And you handled your moment like a woman. Quiet, steady, proud." Jasmine swallowed hard, nodding, emotion catching in her throat. "Still," she said, voice softer now, "they shouldn't have—" "They didn't win," Naya interrupted gently. "Look around." Jasmine turned slightly. A few parents nearby were watching them, not with suspicion, but with something close to reverence. One father even tipped his head in Nia's direction, a gesture of respect. Jasmine looked back at her mother. Who were those people that stood up for you? Nia followed her gaze across the parking lot, where Julian Wade and a few of the others stood in quiet conversation near a black SUV. They're people I've bled with, she said. People who don't ask why when they see something wrong. They just show up. Jasmine nodded slowly, letting the truth of that settle inside her. You always knew who had your back. Nia smiled. I didn't need to know. I just had faith. And in that moment, with the sun warm on their shoulders and a diploma in Jasmine's hand, faith felt like the strongest force in the world. As the last of the families drifted toward their cars and the scattered remains of the celebration clung to the breeze, ribbons, confetti, the tail end of a balloon caught in a tree, Nia and Jasmine walked side by side down the edge of the parking lot, neither of them rushing. Jasmine still held her diploma folder tight against her chest like it meant more than paper ever could, and Nia carried nothing but the presence she always had. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. It was the quiet that came after a storm passed, after dignity had done its work. Finally, Jasmine glanced sideways. You really weren't going to say anything, were you? Nia gave a small smile, eyes forward. No, I didn't come there to prove anything. I came to watch you walk. Jasmine exhaled, somewhere between admiration and frustration. But what if they hadn't backed off? Nia looked at her then, really looked. Then I would have stayed exactly where I was. Some people think respect is something you have to chase or shout for, but you don't need to raise your voice to hold your ground. You just need to know who you are, and not flinch when someone else doesn't. Jasmine slowed her steps, letting those words sink in. They treated you like you didn't belong, she said. They tried. Nia's voice was even. But belonging isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you decide. They reached the Bronco. It looked a little older under the California sun, dust on the bumper and a small dent near the rear fender. But to Jasmine, it felt like something solid, like legacy on wheels. She placed her hand on the door handle and paused. When did you learn to sit that still? Not just physically. I mean, inside. Nia chuckled softly, unlocking the door. The first time someone tried to push me out of a room I'd earned my place in. I was 23. Different uniform, different crowd, same looks. But that day I realized something. They could move the furniture, but they couldn't move me unless I let them. Jasmine opened the door, climbed into the passenger seat, and turned to face her mother as she started the engine. I want to be like that, she said. Nia didn't look over. She just put the truck in gear and replied, You already are. The engine of the Bronco rumbled to life, low and steady, like the heartbeat of something that had weathered decades without giving up. Nia eased the truck out of the parking spot and turned onto the winding exit lane that looped behind the school's athletic field. Jasmine sat quietly, her cap in her lap now, her eyes watching the passing landscape of bleachers, goalposts, and a scattering of classmates taking selfies by the fence. The sun had shifted slightly, casting long afternoon shadows across the blacktop, and the heat shimmered off the pavement in soft waves. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't press, just breathed. Then Jasmine broke it, her voice softer now, like she was thinking aloud more than asking. Do you think they knew who you were? Nia's hand stayed steady on the wheel. I don't think it mattered. Jasmine turned toward her. But they disrespected you. In front of everyone. Nia nodded once, eyes on the road. Yes, and everyone saw it. But they also saw what happened next. Not because I shouted, not because I threw titles around, but because I didn't budge. She glanced at her daughter then, briefly. Power doesn't always come from what you say. Sometimes it comes from what you won't do. I wouldn't give them the reaction they were hoping for. I wouldn't make it easier for them to paint me angry or ungrateful or threatening. I gave them stillness, and the people who mattered understood it for what it was. Jasmine looked forward again, processing that. Outside, a breeze pushed the tall grass along the road's edge into slow, synchronized movement. I wanted to yell, she said. When I saw them hovering over you like that, I wanted to stop the whole ceremony. Naya smiled faintly. And that's why you're strong, Jazz. You had the fire, but you knew when not to let it burn everything down. They pulled onto the main road, leaving the school behind them, but carrying something far more permanent. Respect, not given, not demanded, held. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the road beneath them, and the golden light spilling through the windshield like warmth you could hold. Jasmine leaned her head against the window, her fingers tracing slow, absent-minded patterns on the edge of her gown. Naya kept her eyes on the road, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting gently near the gear shift. There was peace between them now, not the kind that comes after everything goes right, but the kind that comes when something wrong's handled with grace and clarity. Finally, Jasmine spoke, her voice soft but certain. You didn't just teach me to be strong today. You showed me what real strength looks like. Quiet, grounded. Not afraid to be seen, even when others try to shrink you. Naya nodded once, her voice steady. That's the kind of strength that lasts. The kind people remember, not because it shouted, but because it stood still when standing mattered. She glanced over briefly, the corners of her mouth lifting. The world will give you 1,000 chances to react. But dignity? Dignity chooses when and how to respond. And when you lead with that, you never walk alone. Jasmine smiled, holding that truth like a gift passed down from generations. As the city skyline came into view and the sun dipped lower behind the hills, a quiet certainty filled the car. They had faced something ugly, and answered with something unshakable. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that silence can be louder than any scream, then don't just watch, share it. And subscribe for more stories that prove true strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just refuses to move.